Contrary to popular belief, the path of the ascetic is not about self-flagellation and the mortification of the flesh, nor is it about locking yourself in prison. In this video, Brother Theophan Miskovic, who was formerly a neuroscientist at Google X, clearly explains exactly how we heal the mind and soul daily to reunite with the divine, exactly as Jesus taught us. This is taken from a lecture at the Catholic University of America and the Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity. I'll leave a link in the description. Enjoy.
Brother Theophan Miskovic, who will be presenting next, was formerly a research scientist at X, the moonshot factory, previously known as Google X, the semi-secret research and development facility, whose aim was to invent and launch radical new technologies aimed at making the world a better place. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor of psychology and integrative neuroscience at Binghamton University, part of the State University of New York system. His research has examined the interplay of emotion, attention, and motivation, the function and development of spontaneous human brain dynamics, and human brain neuromodulation using electromagnetism and ultrasonic methods. In 2016, he was honored with the Rising Star Award bestowed by the Association for Psychological Science. The prestigious award recognizes early career scientists who have made significant contributions to psychological science. In 2023, Brother Theophan entered New Skeet Monastery as a novice monk. Brother Theophan.
Thank you, Robin, and all of the organizers for inviting me to speak at the conference. Very grateful for this opportunity. And today I'd like to just share some ideas that reflect the marriage of two fields of inquiry that have been really very dear and close to my heart for a while. And this is the union of scientific and contemplative understanding. And my hope is that the ideas that I will discuss are living ideas, ideas that can be implemented and lived out. So we take them out of here into our regular world and hopefully make use of them. Metropolitan Callistus Ware predicted that the theological leitmotif of the 21st century will be an anthropological one. A burning question to address will be, what is the human person? Maybe more so than the ecclesiological question of what is the church, which occupied so many theologians in the past centuries. Metropolitan Callistus envisioned that answering this foundational question of human personhood should reflect a confluence of streams, not only theology, but the totality of human endeavor, including the sciences and the arts. And here I would also add neuroscience, psychology, and contemplative practice. So here's a brief map of the territory I'd like to cover today. So first, to start, I want to spend some time on what we could call the diagnosis of the human condition, specifically our fallen, fragmented human condition. Theosis is a journey of transcendence that aims at something far more integrated, wholesome, and holy relative to the position in which humans find themselves in this world. But in order to know where we are headed, we need a really precise understanding of where we're starting. So the story that I'm telling you today is a story about being in or out of communion with reality. It's a story about how we move from being initially isolated, separated, fragmented, and head toward being more integrated, holistic, and whole. And we do that through communion. And after this groundwork, the second half of the talk then reviews some of the key processes involved in this dynamic of healing. And rather than overwhelming you with a lot of background information on the brain, I'm going to be making extensive use of different metaphors, analogies, and images for us to contemplate. So first, theosis. Now, in the Christian understanding, Theosis is the purpose and aim of our human life. It's why we're on this planet. But what is it? Well, first of all, it's a living reality. In other words, it's to be lived by persons who are walking that path of theosis. But as I'm defining it today, theosis is a lifelong, dynamic process of deep interior transformation onto likeness with God and Christ as the ultimate archetype. Through consistent synergia, or co-action of human effort and divine grace, it affects a gradual transformation of human consciousness, changing our subjectivity down to its roots, with ever-deepening deification and sanctification of all human functions, including thought, desire, emotion, imagination, willpower, virtuous action, and our physical bodies. And today, I'm only going to be speaking about the human pole, or the human dimension of the synergia. In other words, that side of this equation that requires effort and spiritual ascesis, because the divine contribution to this is a profound mystery that I certainly can't say much about. So we can see theosis as a lifelong journey in a symphonic movement from a state of incoherence, disorder, and fragmentation toward wholeness, integration, and communion between self, creation, God, and the whole created world. Today, we will glimpse something about this dynamical movement from multiple levels, integrating patristics, neuroscience, psychology, and contemplative practice. So the beginning of the theosis journey is from a state of spiritual illness. It is a state of being out of communion with God, an ultimate reality, and inhabiting what I refer to as an ego tunnel. An ego tunnel is a highly subjective state of consciousness in which the human being is chained to the pull of passions, disordered movements of the soul and body. So I would define the fallen condition as a psychosomatic mode of organization in which our governing experience is that of being skin-encapsulated egos who are striving to satisfy passing pleasures and avoid all pain and discomfort. And then we die. Metropolitan John Zizoulas called this our biological hypostasis. That's what we're born into. Now, as the Romanian theologian Dumitru Stăniloae put it, the essence of the passions is that they render the human being passive to the sway of impulses over which we have no intentional control. In short, the fallen human being is an automaton or a robot. Science primarily concerns itself with the study of the human as a sophisticated automaton or a biocomputer. By contrast, patristic anthropology has always distinguished itself by emphasizing two distinct modes of human existence. There are two paths we can take in life. The first path is what I just mentioned. It's a merely biological hypostasis. This mode is sensory or image-driven, it's reactive, it's mechanical, essentially it's sleepwalking our way through life. It's passively molded and shaped by collisions with passions and logismoi, thoughts, that are all conditioned by the mindless laws of association. But there is another path through life, the straight and narrow gate, the path of theosis. And this requires intentional effort, cooperating with the energies of God's deifying grace and energies, and it results in reformation of the human person according to the archetype of Christ. These two paths in life are mentioned numerous times throughout the scriptures and patristic commentaries on the scriptures. And I've organized some of the different terms in this table. And you will note that the left column in this table corresponds to our default starting position, from which theosis is trying to move us away from. In other words, the left column is that mode of human function that is involuntary, following in the tracks passively laid down by experience and taking a path of least resistance. The right-hand column requires effort or spiritual ascesis. It is conscious, voluntary, requires wrestling with one's more automatic reactions. Or we could understand this as a divinely guided psychotherapy or re-education of the merely biological and animal side of our human nature. Now, I'd like to move a little bit, just a little bit, into the neurobiology of all of this. And obviously, I have nowhere near the amount of time required to do this topic any justice. So I'm going to be oversimplifying. I ask for your forgiveness. But at least one major brain network that we should introduce here is the so-called default mode network, or the DMN. And the brain structures that make up the default mode network are shown as colorful blobs on this slide. These structures are recruited together in synchrony as the network comes online when we are not intentionally directing our attention. So this is the network responsible for the noisy mental chatter and all the fantasizing that we do so much of. It likes to time travel. It's often ruminating about things that happened in the past. It's fantasizing about the future, or it's worrying about the future. And it keeps a running commentary about everything that is going on right now, and involves mindlessly generating all the opinions, judgments, and thoughts about others, and what others think about us, that often dominate and sap our energies. So the default mode network corresponds to that very busy, speedy, and repetitive part of our mental faculty that continually creates the sense of being a solid, separate self. Martin Laird wrote that we spend much of our time mind-tripping on inner videos. Well, the main production center of these inner videos is right here, the default mode network. And a very substantial chunk of the brain's metabolic energy goes into maintaining this sort of spontaneous, freewheeling mode of operation. Now, I don't mean to demonize the default mode network because it does serve important purposes. It can also be the basis for creative thinking, free association, problem solving. And there is certainly a benefit in remembering the past to learn useful lessons from it. So for example, the default mode network would probably be highly engaged or activated during the contemplative practice of the remembrance of death. So that's a good thing. So the default mode network has its very legitimate and necessary uses. The problem, though, is that unless we are practicing conscious self-monitoring, or nepsis, as I'll talk about, it easily gets kicked into hypergear. So the default mode network has a tendency to become excessively isolated from the rest of the brain and from the rest of the body. It slips out of communion, so to speak. And to make it worse, we're set up in evolutionary terms to just give more importance and attention to negative experiences. So we're often stewing in this sort of negative, judgmental brain chatter, this monologue that's always happening. Contemplative tools and ascesis, combined with a sacramental life, can help us to steer and guide the default mode network to make sure that we can tell the warning signs of a runaway train and help to bring it into a state of integration or communion with the rest of the brain, the rest of the body, and the rest of the God's creation. Now, the brain maintains an actively updated, gradient, hierarchical representation of space and time, self and world. And we can situate the default mode network as occupying the very top rung of this hierarchy. So in other words, what that means is that it is the furthest removed from the actual raw facts of life as it is lived in the present moment. Instead, the default mode network primarily deals with running as-if simulations, and a good chunk of our mental suffering originates from getting completely absorbed into these simulations. So our subjective adult life is spent heavily enmeshed in abstract conceptual frames, all entangled with verbal networks, with language. And we contact life to a large degree through this intermediate filter, substantially conditioned by this overly isolated or separated default mode network. And one outcome of this is a state that is known as cognitive fusion. In other words, we easily mistake our thoughts about reality for reality itself. And the sad truth is that this heavily constricts and limits our freedom, potential, and dignity as whole human beings made in the image of God. The core fixation seems to go something like this. I am over here, and I'm separate from something other that is over there. And once we fixate on something other, then our brains automatically begin to evaluate. Do I like it or do I dislike it? Is it for me or is it against me? Do I accept it or do I reject it? Now, these are all concepts, but they form the frames that compose those internal movies that we then get involved in or mind trip on. And one implication of this is that our ordinary, so-called normal state of waking consciousness is actually very similar in nature to an online form of dreaming or hallucinating. And this metaphor of waking life as being a kind of a dream is not only something you encounter in Buddhism. Patristic references are full of similar allusions. Now, if you're curious to know more details about some of the neuronal and psychological glue that keeps this dream-creating engine or process running, I recently wrote a book about this topic, combining insights from neuroscience and contemplative traditions. And that book will be out in early 2025, next year. Now, I'd like to use a visual metaphor here. So, you see that there is a substantial dense layer of trash completely cluttering the surface of this mountain river, making the river's surface lose its natural transparency in reflecting the beauty of the natural world around it. That dense canopy of trash represents the thicket of concepts, filters, and all those as-if simulations that are constantly throttling our mind stream. Unfortunately, we often mistake our very identity with that layer of trash that is floating on the top. And we're never making direct contact with the fresh, pristine, living waters that run below the surface thoughts and below the surface emotions. And as a result, we lose our transparency to the freshness of reality that surrounds us. So what I'd suggest is that just as much as we talk about conservation of the outer environment, we need to concern ourselves with becoming more conscious stewards of our inner environments. And in fact, I would suggest that the two are intimately related. The outer reflects the inner. Now, I want to talk about asceticism and its discipline as a very rigorous form of mind training. So first, what is the main purpose or aim of asceticism? And I love this quote, which comes from an essay by a French Orthodox archimandrite, Elie. And he says that asceticism is a liberation from the meshes of individuality. We are entangled in the nets of our own subjectivity regularly. And this is a genuine illusion. We perceive the world through this filter, and we think we're experiencing reality, but we're very rarely having glimpses of the actual freshness of reality. And upon reading this quote about the aim of asceticism, which is to basically perform an unveiling or an uncovering, I immediately had this image of this icon of Christ come to my mind, where he's resurrecting Lazarus from the tomb. So truth, in the person of Christ, arrives to unwrap the tangled veils of subjectivity from our inner spiritual eyes in order to reveal itself. And it allows us to transcend our limited biological hypostasis and become Eucharistic human beings. So my suggestion is that asceticism of the mind, to some extent at least, can be approached as an extremely sophisticated science of inner experience. So when I, as a mind scientist and a novice contemplative, when I really began to immerse myself in the rich spiritual tradition of orthodoxy, I discovered that the church fathers and mothers were masterful psychologists. And it's no wonder, really, because the persons who were most intensely engaged in this interior, unseen warfare we're not only discovering, but transcending the laws that shape and constrain the flow of our psychological life. That we're transforming their consciousness from the inside out down to its roots and leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs for future explorers. Now, I've highlighted just a few key processes that I'd like for us to discuss today. And they are nepsis, or what today we might call attention control, inner prayer, or contemplative prayer, and deepening of embodiment. And these three processes interact to produce a lasting shift in a human being's psychosomatic center of gravity, making human persons increasingly more transparent and receptive to the energies of grace. Now, I labeled these processes separately for the sake of our discussion, but really they form a dynamical virtuous cycle. Each component amplifies and strengthens the next component, and together they impart energy for the growth of a new human being embodied in the image or archetype of Christ. So first, nepsis, also known as watchfulness, sobriety of mind, or what a modern psychologist might refer to as attention control. The English translators of the Philokalia defined it as an attitude of attentiveness. It involves a self-observation of inward thoughts and fantasies. It entails keeping some control or a guard over the intellect, that is, thoughts, memories, and imaginations, and also a guard over the heart, motivational impulses and emotions. Now, nepsis is not necessarily intense concentration as some of the Buddhists talk about. Instead, it's a more gentler, somewhat impartial stance of witnessing the flow of one's mental life. And nepsis was always treated as a critical skill for practicing Christians. In fact, as a form of spiritual ascesis or exercise, its roots go back even further to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians. We can say that without attentiveness, there can be no authentic prayer. Now, one contemporary elder, spiritual elder, Elder Sergei, offers the following advice, which I think beautifully captures the function of nepsis. Avoid letting your interior life go its own way, because inevitably it will end up on that slippery slope that leads to sin. No matter what the cost, you must resist drifting wherever the winds might take you. And I'd actually like to take this slippery slope quite literally. Today, the application of dynamical systems language in neurobiology models the operation of large-scale populations of brain neurons as collectively creating a sort of landscape along which neural activity flows. And similarly, because experience tracks brain physiology, there are now some really nice models of such state spaces of consciousness. Now, in this image, you can think of the sphere as indicating the trajectory of flows in brain activity. As neural activity unfolds in your brain, it tends to follow the grooves and patterns that have been passively laid down or inscribed into your neural pathways by your genetics and your experiences from your past. You could also think of the sphere as the luminous tip of your present point of awareness. It follows a certain trajectory so that the next sequence of thoughts or daydreams you have is not entirely random. It is being sculpted by the past history of emotionally tinged thoughts and memories. So if you just allow yourself to be passively carried by the flow of the mind stream, you're going to have a very high probability of visiting previously explored pathways. You're going to be taking the same round of thoughts, feeling the same repertoire of emotions, and sort of going in a circle over and over again. Okay, so why is it important to activate a capacity for voluntary control of attention, the practice of nepsis? Well, from a scientific point of view, conscious monitoring, sort of a mindfulness of your inner state, destabilizes the automaticity of those well-worn grooves. Awareness makes the overly rehearsed and well-oiled neuronal networks modifiable, susceptible to change. The ruts in our habitual ways of organizing ourselves begin to loosen up. They become softer, more pliable to change. To quote from one textbook in neurodynamics, to behave differently requires awareness of one's habitual behavior, and considerable deliberate effort must be expended to behave contrary to one's usual tendencies, since the neural pathways most readily activated are those that subserve habitual activity. So here's a very simple formula I'm proposing. When nepsis is joined with inner prayer, it leads to positive or intentional neuroplasticity. The default position, which requires no effort and runs by itself, is that all the experiences we have, all the things we're exposed to, including the biological urges that impel us, these are all imprinting one set of grooves into our nervous system. The problem is we are completely passive to this action. We have little or no say in the process. By contrast, intentional neuroplasticity gives us some conscious agency or an ability to exercise our God-given free will. We can change the track that we are on and get onto a more healthy track. So we are gradually becoming a new creation, persons who are taking on the form of the image. Now, next, I'd like to consider the action of prayer as a healing of attention. So consider the slots that are around the perimeter of the circle as representing the contents of our consciousness. So these are thoughts, memories, fantasies, feelings, and all the permutations of these states. And these contents are passing into and out of our awareness like lapping waves, circling around the remembered past and an imagined future. And the tracks that they're on are conditioned by past emotional reinforcements. So we are tethered to our passions, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, avoiding discomfort. Ordinarily, our attention is completely absorbed and identified with these shifting contents of consciousness. Attention, which is a vital force, is drawn from our center and fused with the contents of our experience. In the understanding of the Philocolic Fathers, attention leaks out from us and gets dispersed in all these passing distractions. And they refer to this as attention following a linear path. From the center, it gets dispersed along the peripheral sideshow, sort of like having a leaky hose that's constantly losing water or energy. And as we begin a practice of inner prayer, that is, prayer joined with nepsis, there is a very gradual redirection of this outward dispersal of attention. Now, in the initial stages of praying, the words of the prayer begin to act as an anchor or a new expanding center of gravity that counteracts the regular dispersion that's usually happening. And what the prayer does on a psychological level is sort of like a foghorn that's calling on this vital force of attention, that recalling it back from the periphery into the center. The Philokalia calls this the circular path of attention. So if you think of attention as a vector force, it now reorients. As prayer progresses, rather than being invested in just the contents of awareness, there's a reservoir of free attention that begins to develop, and it concentrates into a single pointedness. And simultaneously with this, there is a continual returning of awareness to the present moment and away from being lost in past memories or future fantasies. So prayer is presumably quieting that agitated default mode network. Experientially, on a psychosomatic level, we can actually feel this as an ingathering into a kind of dimensionless center point in the core of our being, a shifting in the center of gravity as our habitual place of resting attention begins migrating from the cranium down approximately into the heart area and then radiating out from the heart area. To go back to the neurodynamics, I'm suggesting that prayer promotes neuroplasticity of this landscape. So initially, the landscape is riddled with these pits or depressions where neural activity gets trapped. And we say that these valleys in the neuronal landscape have low transition energy, meaning it takes no effort to get there. Neural activity, and by extension experience, just sort of goes there on its own momentum. You could think, for example, of Evagrius's 8 thoughts as corresponding to very low transition energy centers in our neuronal landscape. And by contrast, we also have these very high hills to climb, and they have a high transition energy barrier in order to get there. It takes a lot of voluntary effort to try and scale these mountains in the landscape. And this might represent the angelic form of being, where we are able to witness events in our life from a more tranquil, spiritual, witnessing presence and exhibit unconditional love and forgiveness of others. So I'm proposing that over a long period of time, nepsis and inner prayer, joined with the sacramental life, gradually melt down the solidity of these entrenched neuronal networks and begin to reconfigure them into a new mold. We become less and less prone to passive capture by the passions. Some of our deep-set dysfunctional patterns of thinking, feeling, reacting are being relaxed as the system settles into a new organization that is conducive to greater psychological flexibility, increased psychospiritual transparency, and greater overall integration. The default mode network becomes less isolated. It is reintegrated or welcomed back into communion with other large-scale neuronal networks that embed the organism into the wider expanse of the body and the world. The antagonistic sort of seesaw relationship that the default mode network normally has with these so-called task-positive networks that situate us in the present moment is slowly being reconciled. A new default center is emerging, a divinized psychobiological mode of organization. But for a long time, maybe our whole life, we're faced with this condition known as bistability in dynamic system science, oscillation. With the assistance of grace, we're carving this new path forward, but the old patterns never really completely go away. So the new pattern has a shallow basin of attraction compared to a very wide basin of attraction of the old man, the old animalistic patterns. So we're now set up for competition between the new and the old. In moments of high stress, a lot of temptation, there is a really fierce battle because the system has a preference to snap back into its familiar grooves. This preference for familiarity is called hysteresis in dynamic systems language. So this requires much patience and forbearance because we are guaranteed to fail and fall in and out of communion. So let's just go back to this depiction just for a little bit. We see that the outer perimeter of the circle is entangled with the more conceptual, abstract layers of the mind and self. These are thickly enmeshed with verbal networks. Those regions of our mind are rich in what is called counterfactual processing. They're mostly based in imagination and constructed narratives rather than being grounded in reality. But below this, we have experiences of self and world that are much more direct and unmediated by a thick fog of cognitive representations. They're much closer to life itself. So one of the things that happens as prayer matures is that there is a growing degree of embodiment happening as prayer becomes more alive and less mechanical. Cognitive fusion, mistaking thoughts of reality for reality itself, is undermined in favor of a more playful, spontaneous, flexible way of being. Okay, this leads me to the last component of our cycle, that's embodiment. Now, Father Meletius Weber said something really interesting. He said that in the Orthodox tradition, properly understood, prayer is actually a matter of going deeper and deeper into the body and not of trying to escape from the body. Similarly, I'd like to recommend to people to read Father Stephen's book on prayer life and our embodiment. And I take this stuff really seriously because neuroscience now tells us that the brain maintains a hierarchical representation of our selfhood. It's sort of like a tree, where the roots and the foundations of the tree are anchored in something that we'll call the deep self, also referred to as a minimal or embodied self. And this self is much more rooted in the intelligence of the body. It's integrating inputs from the gastrointestinal, the cardiovascular, and other visceral systems. And this deep self is in continuous communion with the energies coming from the world around us. It connects us with the freshness of the present moment. We contact the cosmos through our incarnation. The upper branches of the tree of selfhood we call our mental or autobiographical self. Very conceptual, very abstract, all mixed up with language. The body as experienced by the mental self is just another physical object. The body is a lived experience from the perspective of the deep self. From the perspective of the deep self, it experiences directly and not through the medium of cognitive representations. Its mode of knowing is unitive, holistic, and immediate. And patristic anthropology knows obviously much more about this than science. And we're approaching the nous here, the deep heart, which knows through this faculty of aesthesis, where there is a conscious sensibility of divine energies. And this is much closer to an ineffable feeling of knowing. So just to wrap all of this up, we could say that our starting position is one of disorganization. We contact reality in a sort of inverted perspective. Instead of entering into contact with reality through our deepest, most true and authentic self, we get it the other way around. This pyramid here is inverted, and it's meant to symbolize that we experience life largely through the distorting prism of the unsure, fragile mental self. The default mode network becomes excessively isolated, and we slip into a hall of mirrors experience of reality. Our experience is fractured between self and world. We're always trying to make the outer world satisfy our whims, but it's never going to work. It's always going to fail. And this is the new center of gravity that Theosis is leading us to. It induces a real conversion in our psychosomatic way of being, situating us in creation from the contact point of the deep self, the self that coheres with Christ. Now, rather than experiencing a fissure between an individual, a separate self, and the world, we have an increasingly conscious experience of ongoing communion with reality. Reality discloses itself as a luminous, living network of here and now interactions encompassing the entire cosmos. The foreground, which is a personal nexus of consciousness, enters into a dynamic dance or a perichoresis with a beneficent and caring background, sort of like the prodigal son returning to the loving embrace of the Father. So let me just go back to the metaphor of the river. A life of ascesis is a conscious stewardship of our interior ecology. The river gradually resumes its pristine transparency. Its ability to reflect back and become a mirror for the beauty of the world around us is restored as its natural property. And this interior asceticism over time also increases our transparency and receptivity to the influence of grace and God's uncreated energies. Dumitru Staniloe says that the saints are characterized by a remarkable degree of natural presence and transparency of these energies. In the living example of the saint, he wrote, the divine consciousness and the human consciousness become transparent to each other, co-inherent. By affirming that this mutual penetration without confusion occurs between God and humanity, Christianity has revealed the unfathomable and indefinable mystery of the human person and his consciousness. So, Theosis magnetizes us toward God, brings us toward increased communion, greater transparency, intentional responsiveness, wholeness, and freedom. And the other path in life heads toward isolation, psychospiritual opacity, mechanical reactivity, fragmentation, and loss of freedom. And it's up to each of us which path we try to be on at any given moment in our life. Thank you.